This is a BBC Watch camera presentation, and we have Berenice Dietsch and Hagar Seller who are going to speak tonight. And in the brochure you'll see the CVs, so I don't need to take you through that. And I'll hand over to Berenice Dietsch.
I'm talking about complaints tonight of the BBC. My real interest is in the process, and I say that because I was a governor of the BBC in the good old days when there were governors, from 2002 to 2006. And I volunteered, having had some experience of complaints handling, I volunteered to sit on the final appeal, the Governor's Appeal Committee for complaints. Oh, no, they said no. I thought the subtext was, if you know about complaints, you're not going to be on it. Anyway, but let me start with the good news. In 2013, I went to the proms, was it 2014? I went to the proms on a Saturday night, and while we were driving back to Oxford, there was a second prom being broadcast, 10 o'clock at night. And it was Nigel Kennedy conducting the Palestine String Quartet. And I had a feeling that something would happen. Anyway, so we listened to a really rather ghastly rendition of Vivaldi. At the end, when the applause was just dying away, Nigel Kennedy said, "This is what can be achieved when you get rid of apartheid." And I thought, no, this will not do. Never mind the sentiment. You can't use a BBC Proms platform for a political statement. Imagine if there'd been a Spanish orchestra and the conductor at the end says, "Free Gibraltar," or something like that. We'd all be up in arms, wouldn't we? So I complained immediately, and in fact I knew who was in charge of the proms. And I have to say, within 24 hours, I got the decision that Kennedy's statement would be cut from the rebroadcast of that particular performance on the ground that it's not a platform for political comments. Nevertheless, the BBC was accused of censorship, and I got a load of unpleasant emails, including from an aging rock star of whom I'd never heard before, called Roger Waters. I'm still not sure I've heard of him. He made much play of my maiden name, which seemed to him to indicate that I might have Jewish blood, or something like that. Anyway, now, the BBC, I think, did the right thing then. But, having listened this week, there were indignant callers to the BBC this week who protested when the Henry Jackson Society drew attention to the actions of Shaka Amer as reasons for why he was imprisoned at Guantanamo. Lots of people rang up and said, "How dare you question the innocence of Shaka Amer?" And in fact, all the Henry Jackson Society spokesman had said was, well, you know, how come he was on holiday doing charitable work in Afghanistan? You know, there must he was picked up and imprisoned. And Saturday, I was listening to Any Answers, you know, the callback after any questions, and a very plummy male voice rang up and said, and the topic was the downing of the plane, of the Russian plane over Sinai, and this person rang up and said, it must have been Israel that shot it down, because the plane was heading that way, and therefore obviously it was Israel that had shot down the plane. And by the way, it was Israel that was behind the invasion of Iraq. And he was hardly challenged by Anita Anand. She sort of said mildly, "Oh really," or something, and left it at that. And that reminded me, going back 9 years, I was listening again to that same programme, Any Answers, and a male caller rang in response to some question about the Middle East to say that the Jews had invaded Palestine in 1948 and expelled 2 million Palestinians. And I dropped my washing up and waited for Nick Clark to challenge it, but he didn't. It just went unquestioned. And I think this is part of one of my themes, sheer lack of education on the part of modern journalists, especially young ones. And the language that's used. Hezbollah rockets directed at Israel in 2006 were described as pinpricks, but Israel's reaction was described by the BBC ramping back with big US Army boots. The same with Gaza this summer, that the line has been that the rockets aimed from Gaza to Israel were pinpricks, and Israel's reaction disproportionate. Then there's the equivalence, which is made not only by the BBC, but everybody who looks at it. Every Palestinian incident of suffering is equated with Jewish suffering in the Holocaust. You'll remember Tim Wilkins at the BBC, Jews at the Paris supermarket, intervened to say, but the Palestinians suffer too. Michael Grade, not me, Michael Grade, former chairman of the Governors, has complained to the BBC and the way they report equivalence in the last couple of weeks between the Israeli victims of stabbing in the streets and Palestinians who were killed as a response to those acts of terror. When a lone gunman goes mad on an American campus, which happens all too frequently, we don't complain, do we, when the forces move in and shoot him dead? I mean, that's regarded as necessary to stop any further bloodbath. And of course, the Palestinians, I believe, who've been stabbing in the last few weeks are not lone wolves. They're always being described as lone wolves. They do, most of them, have a context as far as one knows. Jeremy Bowen has blamed the stabbings on the occupation rather than the religious fanaticism that will not accept the presence of non-Muslims, let alone Jews, in the Middle East. And the repeated false numbers that most of the Palestinians killed in Gaza in 2014 were civilians. The BBC has reported that and indeed has dismissed a complaint that said you should have looked at the numbers more closely. Those figures came from Hamas-controlled authorities. There's a media obsession with Israel, partly explained by the fact that journalists can move around Israel freely and safely, unlike many of the other countries they go to. You don't hear them reporting very much on the Turks and the Kurds, Turkey and Cyprus, China and Tibet, India and Kashmir, South American despots, etc. The same is true for Parliament, where debates are largely chosen by members of Parliament and peers and tend to reflect their own interests and obsessions and not necessarily what's going on right across the world. Now, why does this matter? It matters because every war incident in Israel leads to a spike in anti-Semitic incidents in the UK and to further diseducation of the UK public. The All-Party Parliamentary Group on Anti-Semitism reported on this in 2006 and how language affects the way in which Jews are perceived by the wider public. The BBC, of all organisations, has a responsibility to present a fair and balanced picture of world events and to understand the impact of language on minorities here, not just Jews. That 2006 report cited a submission to it that the Israel-Palestinian conflict is not reported with the same detachment as Darfur or Chechnya. Remember them? Don't hear much about them these days. Today you could add the Ukraine or Crimea. There is a fashionable disgust for Israel in the West. No one really cares about the Congo or Nigeria. Israel's come to be a symbol of all that's wrong with the West, as some believe, especially as it is the Holy Land. Israelis are the heirs to the age-old unpleasant depiction of Jewish bankers or communists in the past. This kind of mildly lefty, trendy view of privately educated journalists are probably overrepresented at the BBC. When I was a governor, and there was a lot of talk about diversity, I called for a survey of BBC journalists. What school had they been to, what university? This was turned down flat. One can but guess. But I don't believe that there is a BBC agenda to be anti-Israel. In fact, I know there is not. There is no central editorial control telling people to be anti-Israel. That is a misapprehension. It is simply an attitude, a phenomenon, shared by The Guardian, by parliamentarians, some of them anyway, and increasingly by the public. And I think it's to do with education. It's a fair bet that the average BBC journalist has not studied history and will be taking in information from the BBC's own training modules and from the newspaper that most predominantly lies around in BBC newsrooms, you can guess. I can't find it now, but a few years ago I found an Israel history module for training journalists on the BBC. And it started with the Holocaust, leading more or less straight into the foundation of Israel. This is very common. If you ask many people who've not had that specialized education about Israel, it tends to be, well, there was the Holocaust and then all the Jews arrived in Israel. And they don't go back 100 years, let alone 1,000 years or 2,000 years. I Googled again the BBC so-called Academy where they train journalists. And you can do the same. Google BBC Academy Israel Palestine. And what you get is language, instructions to journalists about not using the phrase terrorist, not referring to Israel having a capital in Jerusalem, referring to Palestine as a historical identity, and so on. Adam Curtis, a journalist who's worked extensively for the BBC, has a blog in which he says Zionism was invented by Herzl in the 1890s, and one of the reasons for the Balfour Declaration was to curry favour with the Zionists and their supporters in the USA in order to get the USA on the UK side in the First World War. Education is sorely needed, and I very much hope that when we commemorate the Balfour Declaration in a couple of years, someone will put together a meticulous PowerPoint on the history of Zionism. I do miss Martin Gilbert. I do miss David Kezarani. They are the people who could have done it so superbly for us. But someone must do it. Now, much would be improved if the complaints process were fairer. I'm completely consistent in this. I have complained over the years not only about the BBC complaint system being too internal. I've made the same complaint about the Advertising Standards Authority, and many people make that same complaint about the press. The three major sources of information we have in this country, indeed around the world, advertising, the press, and the BBC, all solve their complaints totally internally, without any outside expert evidence. Not only have I said this, the Lords Select Committee on Communications called for the BBC complaint system to be transferred to Ofcom or to an ombudsman in their report on the BBC a couple of years ago. I favour the latter, an ombudsman. At the moment, the final appeal about a complaint at the BBC is to the Editorial Standards Committee of the Trust. The Trust succeeded the governors. The Trust is just the same as the governors, except they're paid about 3 times as much, which does rile me. But anyway, that committee has 5 trustees, and it's staffed by the BBC with no outside influence or chance for the complainant to make their case in person. This final appeal committee has its own chosen editorial advisor, and the complainant does not get to see the material provided by the advisor. Judging by the usual standards of BBC guidelines about Israel, it is possible that this compounds inaccuracy on inaccuracy. Only 30 complaints have been upheld by that final appeal committee in the 5 years up to 2013, representing 0.0025% of the over 1 million complaints originally received. The trustees may reject an appeal even at this stage if it does not, in their view, raise an issue of substance as they determine. For example, a detailed complaint about the division of civilian and terrorist casualties, as I mentioned, in Gaza in 2014 was dismissed, largely because the BBC said it had used United Nations figures, and that if the numbers were shown later to be wrong, that is, more terrorists turned out to be killed, this could be corrected later. If you Google BBC Trust appeals, you'll find detailed appeals. They are transparent month after month after month. Most months have got something about Israel in them. That same month, there was a complaint that a BBC interviewer was speaking about Hamas as having a democratic mandate, and that the interviewer did not refer to the coup. That complaint was rejected. To be fair, a complaint by a viewer that Shimon Peres had been interviewed on his own without a Palestinian counter-argument was also rejected. I think fair enough. Now, I favour an ombudsman over the existing complaints procedure. You can look it up. It's arcane. I printed off a summary, and that was 11 pages. I favour an ombudsman and not Ofcom, because Ofcom is in no way superior to the BBC. in the way that you expect when a legal appeal moves from a lower court to a higher court. Ofcom is, if anything, on a level with the BBC, arguably maybe even lower. Also, Ofcom is heavily peopled with ex-BBC people who will be as touchy as their current counterparts at the notion of bias at the BBC. And the Ofcom members are appointed by the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. And if you're appointed in that way and you're not at the end of your career and maybe you want to be reappointed, you're going to be watching your P's and Q's. The BBC, however, is tasked with settling its own complaints concerning accuracy and impartiality, thus preserving its independence, while taste and decency are handled by Ofcom. So already you have a complicated divided structure. There's a little overlap, but Ofcom does taste and decency, which is summed up in the words Jeremy Clarkson and Russell Brand. Me, frankly, I don't care. The BBC does accuracy and impartiality, things like climate change, wars, Israel, the things that really matter, that go to the heart of the BBC's worldwide reputation as the best broadcaster, which I do believe it to be. The BBC complaints procedure, as I said, is complicated. Apologies, when you get them, are reported in the press, but you can hardly find them on the BBC website. And of course, where they should be, those apologies, is on the very programme where the mistake was made in the first place. If the 10 o'clock news gets it wrong, the mistake should be corrected on the 10 o'clock news. If Any Answers gets it wrong, the apology should be on Any Answers or Any Questions, not on the website. That's not good enough. That won't do. At each stage of the complaints procedure, which has about 3.5 stages, the BBC staff have wide discretion to dismiss the complaint as ill-founded in their view. The findings are made entirely inside the organisation with no outside oversight. The odds are stacked against the complainant because of the complex procedure and because to make a decent complaint, you've got to allege a breach of the editorial guidelines. You've got to go to the guidelines and say, my complaint is in relation to, I'm inventing this, paragraph 1.4, which says you must present a context, or whatever it says. You must not favour one side or the other. Whereas unfortunately, most people write in, you're disgusted of Tunbridge Wells, you know, your programme was sickening and disgusting. And of course the BBC dismiss it. What you've got to do is pin your complaint to the paragraph of the editorial guidelines, which in your view has been breached. And because most people don't realise that, it's very easy to dismiss complaints as coming in bad language, being abusive or repetitive, which the BBC staff do often say. And it's no good just complaining about bias, which again most people do. You've got to find that bit of the charter or the guidelines, do your homework, and say exactly what it is in your view that's been breached. Now, a first complaint usually gets a standard rejection, stage 1, and the complainant has to write again within strict time limits to get it to the next stage. He or she can then appeal further to the editorial complaints unit, which has upheld 166 complaints over that same 5-year period, again from over 1 million received. And then you get finally to the trustees, as I said, that body of 5 trustees. Now, the BBC's alleged impartiality is what makes it a world influence to the world service. I love the BBC. It has stature. We would all be lost without it. One of the happiest moments in my life was a holiday in France, driving through the Loire, and I managed to pick up on the radio The Archers. And I thought life holds no greater pleasure than to be driving through the Loire, sampling wine, and to get The Archers live. I mean, we know we'd all be lost without the BBC. And although I'm saying the complaints process is bad, it still stands head and shoulders above any other broadcasting organisation in the world. You are but to travel, and you know it. Nevertheless, because I care so much about its world stature, it is therefore of the utmost significance that the complaints process matches the significance of the issues which are under discussion. These days, it is best practice that complaints will be determined by an independent arbiter who is not associated with the organisation being complained against. There's a funerals ombudsman. There's an ombudsman for just about everything you want to name, an outside adjudicator who determines complaints. The legal profession no longer self-regulate. The medical profession no longer self-regulates. There's a separate organisation to do it. The exceptions are, as I said, the press, though that's going through a certain amount of change and turmoil at the moment. And you can see how hard those in favour of self-regulation are fighting within the press and the Advertising Standards Authority, as I mentioned. I favour an ombudsman because of the sensitivities that might otherwise arrive. An ombudsman should be a person of distinction with no further career ambitions, someone who's reached the top of their particular tree and has retired, who can afford to be fearless with his or her own staff, whose findings could be rejected by the trust if it survives. And I say that because I understand the arguments about BBC independence and how many people would be up in arms. They said an ombudsman could overrule the BBC. In many organisations, this is what happens. You have a very respected senior person as the ombudsman. They investigate, they make a finding, they report back to the trust, and that has to be public. And if the trust were to reject it, probably they would suffer opprobrium. At the least, they'd have to give very, very good reasons. The BBC has used independent persons before when reviewing its coverage of sensitive issues. For example, Lord Wilson of Dinton was entrusted to review the European Union coverage a few years ago, and Sir Quentin Thomas reviewed the BBC's Middle East coverage a few years ago, and he made comments that will be familiar to all of you. There should be more historical context. More things should be explained. Emotive language should not be used, and so on. It was a very fair report. The BBC handles the most important questions in our national life. Indeed, they set the agenda. They have to strike a balance between public interest, journalistic freedom, impartiality, and accuracy. This is very much editorial and political territory, and I appreciate the BBC's sensitivity about what an adverse finding might mean. In my view, these issues can only fairly be considered by an outsider with a track record of expertise and judgment. And then the editorial standards of the Committee of the Trust should be disbanded. Thank you.
Can I introduce you to Haddad Seller of BBC Watch? Once again, her CV is in the brochure, so over to Haddad.
We, BBC Watch, recently submitted or made a submission to the committee which is examining the review of the BBC's charter, and what I want to run with you through with you tonight is what we've proposed and why. Most importantly, the BBC's motto. Speaking at Chatham House in May 2010, the BBC's former Director General Mark Thompson made the following remarks: "Nations should speak peace unto nation." In 5.5 years since that speech was made, of course, we've seen a great surge of extremism in the world, which not only gives resonance to those particular words as they sound, but also adds another perspective to them, and that is of a nation speaking as peace to its own nation in order to tackle the problem of extremism facing Britain today. With its unrivaled outreach and reputation, that means that the role of the BBC, which we all admire and value so much, is critical in promoting that aspiration of mutual understanding and tolerance at home and abroad. What you'll hear in this presentation is born out of that same aspiration, but also out of the conviction that in order to achieve it, the news and information provided by the BBC must, as its founding charter and editorial guidelines dictate, be accurate and impartial. For For the past 3 years, we at BBC Watch have been conducting daily monitoring of BBC content across its range of platforms, and that documentation facilitates an overview of a number of issues which, if addressed at this juncture of the renewal of the Charter, can contribute to ensuring that through the period of the next 10-year BBC Charter, or however long it will be, we don't know just yet, the corporation will be better placed to serve its funding public not only as a broadcaster but also as a cherished cornerstone of British society. One very important subject which Baroness Deach has of course already touched on is what I call the accuracy of historical record. And if we can move over to the next. The BBC is so trusted and its reputation is so reliable that it's used both by the public and by researchers and by academics and by teachers and by other broadcasters as a source of information. So obviously when the BBC gets it wrong, a lot of other people get it wrong as well. And the BBC relates to its own online archive content as permanent public record and historical record, and hence the accuracy of that content is vital. No less crucial, of course, is the accuracy and impartiality of BBC material produced specifically for educational purposes. And this is one example from it's now been renamed, but at the time it was called Learning Zone. It's a resource for secondary school educators, which, as you can see, described the Yom Kippur War as the initial Egyptian and Syrian attacks of the Yom Kippur War as being preemptive. That obviously changes your entire view of the Yom Kippur War. But that was for children, for people educating children. You can look at the bottom and see who was responsible for that content. I'm not sure those are the people I'd want as teaching my children, but we will relate to that as well later in a moment. That's been changed. You won't find that on the website anymore. We made a complaint to the BBC and it's been changed. We don't always succeed, however. These are two additional articles about the Yom Kippur War. As you see, they both still appear on the BBC website. As you see, the number of Israeli losses is actually about nearly 3 times the actual factual number of losses. Numerous BBC reports online, they're accessible to anybody conducting a search for Jenin on the BBC website, will tell you that there was a massacre in Jenin in the year 2002. Of course there wasn't. The UN says there wasn't, we all know there wasn't. But if you're looking on the BBC website, if you are a student, and by the way, BBC content is admissible in student papers, unlike, say, Wikipedia, then you would find that there'd been a massacre in Jenin. There wasn't, but that has never been corrected. Those articles stand exactly like that still on the BBC website. Same with the Second Intifada. If you're looking for information on why there was a Second Intifada in Israel, it was, according to BBC content, because Ariel Sharon went to visit Temple Mount. We know that's not true. We know it was planned long in advance, but that's what children looking for information, say if they're doing a school project, will find on the BBC website. Historical accuracy is obviously very important for its own sake and to enable members of the public and children and students to reach informed opinions, but historical inaccuracy can also fuel intolerance and even violence. These two photographs on the left were both taken in London, one in April 2013 and one in June 2013. The picture they show, and also the picture on the right, which is from the Guardian newspaper, claim to show a Palestinian father carrying the body of his dead child and imply that Israel is to blame for that. Why would these people and the Guardian newspaper, the pictures I just I presume at the Guardian newspaper, presume that that picture has anything to do with Israel? Because it doesn't. That picture actually shows a Palestinian father carrying the body of his child who had been killed by a misfired rocket fired by a terrorist organisation in the Gaza Strip. But this is the report the BBC put out at the time. It was promoted very, very heavily. You'll see on social media a BBC correspondent at the top, the BBC's head of the Jerusalem Bureau at the time, Paul Danaher. There was no doubt that this was happened because of an Israeli airstrike. It's just not true. And the UN, in its report several months later, showed that it wasn't true. It's far too late. By the time, as they say, you know, by the time the truth got its pants on, the lies are halfway around the world or whatever. It's too late. As far as the people in those demonstrations we saw before are concerned, as far as the Guardian's pictures editor is concerned, that picture shows Israeli guilt, and it doesn't. The CST, in their report on anti-Semitic incidents last year, noted the connection between media coverage and anti-Semitic incidents here in the UK. And if you look at the bit in red at the bottom, on the 28th of July, the media reported an explosion at the Shifa hospital. It was also at the Shati refugee camp in Gaza. The CST recorded 22 anti-Semitic incidents in the UK. Okay, so let's have a look at what the media reported on that day. You see the tweet at the top. That BBC Twitter account has 18.9 million followers around the world. There is no doubt from that tweet that an Israeli airstrike has hit a hospital in Gaza. It didn't. It didn't. Again, we were talking about misfired rockets. And the sad part of this story is that an hour after the incident, it took place about 5 o'clock, 10 past 5 in the afternoon. An hour after the incident, the IDF released, first of all, a statement saying that they hadn't been operating in the area at the time, and secondly, they released aerial photographs which showed the trajectory of missiles which had been fired by one of the Palestinian terrorist organisations in the Gaza Strip and where they'd fallen. And one had fallen in Shati, one had fallen in Shifa, one in the sea, and one had continued on the direction of Ashkelon in Israel. This report at the bottom was a filmed report on BBC television. This went out about 7 hours after the incident. 6 hours after the IDF has made it clear that it wasn't responsible for that incident. It doesn't say 100% the Israelis did this, but it doesn't say they didn't. And the tone, you can see the tone of the we have the theme of children, we have the theme of blood, we have some themes which are very difficult afterwards to correct. So if we could pass on to the next one, thank you. Several days after that, after the incident itself, it's still being presented as disputed, and that article in a slightly different form, because the other things have been added to it, but it's still there on the website today. As that incident is still described over a year later as a disputed incident, when it isn't at all. You can see at the bottom right, this is an Italian journalist who, once he'd got out of Gaza, told people what had actually gone on there. Again, the CST report, as you see, they highlighted the use of phrases such as child murders or baby killers in anti-Semitic incidents. You can see at the top, that's from the CST report. There's a direct link there. I'm reading the BBC. I'm watching the BBC. The picture at the bottom shows an interview from a demonstration in London. An interview, it was about 2.5 minutes long, with Tariq Ali was conducted. Throughout the entire interview, that sign at the back was what BBC viewers saw on their screen. Nobody moved the camera, nobody stopped the interview. There's a delay in live broadcasts. Nobody used the fact that there's a delay in live broadcasts to get somebody to move that sign. And of course the all-party report, the all-party parliamentary inquiry into anti-Semitism, which published its report in February of this year, also took note of the fact that the BBC had been cited by many of the people who gave testimony to their report. There was a lot of BBC coverage of demonstrations against Israel in the UK last summer, summer before, 2014. The phenomenon at the bottom, which those pictures were all taken at demonstrations in the UK in the summer of 2014, but BBC audiences never found out about that side of the demonstrations in the UK. This is very recent. This is a demonstration in London last month. Hands off Al-Aqsa. One thing I've been monitoring in the last month, and it's in my view it's a particularly dangerous and inflammatory theme, is that we've had BBC reporters wrongly saying that the entire area of Temple Mount is called Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's not. It's not. We've had BBC reporters telling, especially on the BBC World Service, that there is an Israeli plan to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque. That is such a toxic meme in the Middle East. I don't know how anybody can possibly pass that off and sleep at night, to be honest. And we even had the BBC telling audiences around the world that Israel is conducting a war on Islam, which is just not true. It's just not true. Regarding the subject of historical accuracy, our proposals are, Baroness Deitch talked about the education at the BBC College of Journalism. It's obviously not working. It's obviously not working. And there is a compulsory, mandatory unit that BBC journalists have to do on the Middle East. It's not working. So that needs to be reviewed and made into a system that actually works. There's no point wasting licence fee payers' money on courses that don't work. Online content, again, Baroness Deitch spoke about it. The historical inaccuracies are often because of, as we saw before, relying on information from Robert Fisk and Noam Chomsky. You're not going to get the most accurate information. That's a very big problem. Even sometimes when complaints are made, such sources are called in as sort of expert witnesses on complaints. There's, again, Baroness Deitch touched on it, there's no dedicated corrections page on the BBC website. There obviously needs to be. It would increase the likelihood that people would receive the information, which is actually supposed to be the point of making a correction, one assumes. But it's important as well because all BBC content which is still online can be subject to editorial complaints. And that means that if there's an article which is inaccurate, then it is likely that public funding will be wasted on dealing with complaints, which could have been avoided by just correcting it or making a correction clear. As I said, the Baroness Deitch, of course, covered the subject of the complaint system very, very fully, but I'd just like to highlight one thing that people might not be aware of. There's a thing called the expedited complaints procedure. And according to that procedure, the BBC can limit the ability of a member of the public to complain. I've seen 2 cases of that in the last few months. One of the reasons can be that a person keeps making complaints which on investigation have no reasonable prospect of success, or have been already rejected and appealed repeatedly. But of course the body which rules whether a complaint has a chance of success is the BBC. So we're in a catch-22 situation here. And a lot of people write to us because the concept of stakeholders in an organisation they are obliged to fund by law being subjected to limitations on complaints on the basis of arbitrary decisions made by that same self-regulating organisation is one which many members of the public find highly objectionable. So let's have a look at just a couple of examples of what would be a complaint which had no prospect of succeeding. So let's... Casualty figures from the Gaza Strip, Baroness Deitch spoke about it as well beforehand. This is a very good article which was published by the BBC on the 8th of August 2014, the middle of the conflict between Israel and Hamas in that summer. And it was published by the BBC's head of statistics. And it was a very, very good article. And it explained why you shouldn't take the statistics as you know, written in stone, because things will become more clear afterwards. A few days later, that article was changed radically. It was changed so radically that it lost its original meaning. And it was changed because political pressure was applied to the BBC. That's very problematic. That's very problematic. So if we can just go to the next one. This is another example of a complaint which you don't make it because it won't succeed. If you want to complain that the BBC doesn't call Jerusalem Israel's capital, and it doesn't. So this is a recent 16th of October, the BBC apologised because one of its journalists inadvertently referred to Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, so there was an apology on the BBC website. And the link at the bottom is actually what's written here. This is the sort of style guide, and which explains that the BBC does not call Jerusalem the capital. But why doesn't it call Jerusalem the capital? And the reason for that is here on the right. Because the BBC still believes that the 1947 partition plan, which didn't even get accepted then, is a thing. And so Jerusalem is some sort of corpus separatum under an international city, and so it's not Israel's capital. That's weird history. By the way, regarding those Gaza casualty figures, as Baroness Leach rightly said, the BBC quotes the UN's figures, and I don't know if the BBC rang the UN up to find out where those figures came from, but I did. And I rang the UN up and said, where do you get casualty figures from? And they said to me that they have three primary sources: B'Tselem, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, and an organisation called Al-Mizan, which is based in Gaza as well. They're all political NGOs. They're all involved in the lawfare campaign against Israel. Their secondary sources are the Hamas-run Health Ministry, the Palestinian Red Crescent, and the local Arabic media in Gaza, which of course is either run by Hamas or operates with the consent of Hamas. So those UN figures aren't exactly what they are made out to be. Our proposals for complaints are very similar to Baroness Leach's, because the issue is very problematic. We had one gentleman complain or write us an email. It was actually not him, it was a member of his family, because he is registered blind and he can't use the BBC complaints form on the website, and he can't write a letter. So he calls in when he listens to the radio, and he calls in with complaints, and he was actually banned from complaining for 2 years because he telephoned to the BBC too much. So the issue of making the system accessible to people with disabilities is obviously something which needs to be examined. And again, the subject of independent handling of complaints at the more advanced stages needs to be, in our opinion, adopted. And the issue of how complaints are regarded. Complaints are legitimate feedback, and they need to be regarded as such, and they are actually the public's way of helping the BBC keep up to its own standards, and it's a pity that they're not always regarded as such. Anti-Semitism and extremism. Prime Minister Cameron in July made a very important speech in Birmingham, and he spoke about how extremism begins and the links between conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. One very, very big problem that we try to monitor it as much as we can, but I'm afraid it's just too big, is BBC discussion boards. In the BBC's charter there is a clause which the BBC interprets as meaning that it should have comments on articles or chat rooms or Facebook or whatever, and so it does. But some of the comments appearing on those BBC fora are plainly anti-Semitic, and these are comments which are after BBC moderation and have been left up. We can go to the next one. There's some more examples. There's Nazi analogies, there's classic anti-Semitic tropes, and these have been left. This is the BBC, I'm very sorry to say, facilitating the spread of anti-Semitic discourse by leaving this up on its own notice boards, on its own Facebook pages. That has to be dealt with, clearly. Oh, this is from the time of the Charlie Hebdo attacks last January in Paris. It's not just anti-Semitic material that appears on these comments boards. Sometimes, as you can see, there is also just sort of general incitement to violence sometimes, and this is clearly something which needs to be taken care of. The most prevalent trope in BBC content is the Jewish lobby trope, and it's become quite sort of regular appearance in the BBC, to be honest. This is a quote at the bottom from 2014, from April 2014. The All-Party Inquiry noted this subject in its report, which was published earlier this year. If we can move on, please. This is, again, from November 2014. We can't all observe dietary laws because it might offend the more powerful lobby, the Israeli lobby, which already has Big Brother America kowtowing to its every wish. I mean, it really is unacceptable. It's kind of un-British anyway. I don't think that needs any comment. Can we pass on? And another one from this, actually a week later, November 2014. Again, we've had these the Jewish lobby affecting British politics, This is about an article which appeared in the paper, but the interjection here in a different colour was from the BBC presenter, who made a link between Jewish donors to the Labour Party and people who will be against the mansion tax as well. So the message is very clear. Even when we have very clear examples of anti-Semitism in Britain, and this is one from 2013, I'm sure you all remember the story of Mr. David Ward, former MP David Ward, the BBC played it down, and it's not the only example. There are lots of other examples where it was made a softer story. So instead of remarks about Jews, it was portrayed as remarks about the Jews in Israel. But the actual remark didn't make any reference to Israel. And this is, again, Baroness Dietsch referred to it, an interview just after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January. Many critics of Israel's policy would suggest that Palestinians suffer hugely at Jewish hands as well. The BBC's response to this there were many complaints. There were a lot of complaints made about that programme, and the BBC's response was, first of all, to say the journalist sent a tweet, so that's okay. Of course, not everybody who saw that BBC programme on the television would have seen his Twitter account, but never mind. Many people continued their complaints through the several stages, and there were so many complaints that they were. It was decided to take them as a sort of one block complaint. And the final decision, which came out later on, which referred to the comment we saw before, it was rejected that this was an anti-Semitic statement. A lot of people claimed in their complaints, or said in their complaints, that it suggested that all Jews are responsible for the actions of Israel. The BBC's editorial complaints unit didn't see it that way, but there's one very interesting part of that decision, which if we can... The BBC obviously doesn't accept the EU MC working definition of anti-Semitism, but the BBC also doesn't work according to any definition of anti-Semitism. So the situation we have at the moment is that the BBC considers itself informed or authority or enough to decide what is and what isn't anti-Semitism, and the members of the public making a complaint concerning anti-Semitism can't possibly know where the goalposts are, because there aren't any. So that's a very big problem as well. Our proposals are, again, we really feel it's very important that the BBC needs to accept and work according to an accepted definition of anti-Semitism. The EUMC definition is the obvious choice because A, it's the one that the all-party parliamentary group works according to, and it's the one which was recommended by the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism in May of this year. And we need to see some real action taken on the subject of educating journalists, moderators, producers on the topic of anti-Semitism. There just isn't enough education, and message board moderators, obviously. And that is, we think, something which will be a great step forward into helping reduce anti-Semitic content, into reduce the type of conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic tropes that Prime Minister Cameron spoke about in BBC content. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome Christians United for Israel, who have come especially to be here with us. And so I'd like to call on Des Starrett to ask the first question, please.
So I'm Des Starrett from Christians United for Israel. We're very concerned about the rise in anti-Semitism in this country. It seems to be a tide flooding across Europe. So we want to ask the panel, do they believe that the current reporting of the situation in the Middle East is actually accelerating that anti-Semitism?
Who wants to take that? Baroness Dietsch.
Well, the question is, will reporting contribute to anti-Semitism?
Yes.
Is it accelerating?
Accelerating.
Well, I'm using the journalistic word discourse. The word was used by the All-Party Parliamentary Group in 2006. It's become
Mainstream to say very unpleasant things about Israel. Nobody seems to object, and I think to that extent it does build up anti-Semitism. And also, one is very often blocked from saying that something is anti-Semitic
because it's dressed up as Israel. I mean, I digress for a moment. I made a complaint to the Advertising Standards Authority about a very long advertisement by Medical Aid for Palestinians, which I thought, and others thought, had very many mistakes in it. It was an extremely long pamphlet, and one of my complaints was that to present Israel in such a barbaric way contributed to anti-Semitism. And the reply I got back from the Advertising Standards Authority was the word Jew wasn't mentioned in the ad, therefore it could not contribute to anti-Semitism. And this is coming in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo massacres and the easy way in which extremists and fanatics move from attacking an Israeli organization to a Jewish one. And when something bad happens in Gaza, we find that Jewish schools in England, Jewish communal organizations, synagogues are targeted. So the enemies, as it were, don't make a distinction between Israeli and Jewish. Therefore, the bad things, I think, do amount to promoting anti-Semitism.
I think both the CST and the all-party inquiry were very clear on that point. They clearly made the connection between media and the incidents which they recorded, and I think it's very obvious that there is. But I think we also need to be clear that the BBC is not. It's an equal opportunity problem in that we've just seen a couple of months ago, a few weeks ago, Jeremy Boyne, for instance, telling BBC audiences that the massive wave of migrants coming to Europe at the moment is because people are running away from ISIS and not from Bashar al-Assad. That's just patently not true. So we're not the only ones who suffer from inaccurate reporting, and we must remember that sometimes.
Do you have any good way of actually framing a complaint which has more chance of success? And then also, how is this whole process of the BBC Charter going ahead? And is there a public, all the paperwork has been put in, but is there now another process before it actually goes before committee?
If you want your complaint to be treated seriously, you've got to get up online the BBC editorial guidelines and say this particular broadcast or interview offended against, and name it, whatever they are. I can't remember them, but you can find it all online. It breached 1.4, it breached 3.7, whatever it is. Don't just write it and say this was disgusting and biased and no good. That will get you nowhere. Say there's been an actual breach of this particular editorial guideline and spell it out. And then I think you do have a slightly better chance. So even that might not help you, as long as the whole thing remains internal. Now, on BBC Charter renewal, in some ways it's a very open process.
There have been consultations and green papers and so on online, which you can look up. In other ways, it's not. Speaking as a lawyer, I have begun to go off royal charters. Royal charters, it was also used in the case of press regulation. A royal charter is a legal document, goes back in history, passed by the Queen in Privy Council. Now, I bet most of you, when you think of the Queen in Privy Council, you imagine her arriving with her crown on and a pencil behind her ear and her glasses, surrounded by 100 wise men, the wisest men in the realm, and they're thrashing something out. No. A royal charter is drafted, well, I don't know who drafts them, but they're agreed by ministers. It's the least democratic process you can imagine. It is cooked up by ministers and the Queen rubber stamps it. And the Royal Charter was used to guarantee the BBC's independence and keep it out of politics in the beginning, 70, 80 years ago. It was also used in the case of press regulation, rather less successfully about a year ago. I now don't think it's such a good idea because parliamentarians won't get, as far as I know, certainly we in the Lords, we won't get to discuss the details of the new charter because it's a deal between the ministers and the BBC. So I actually would prefer it if the BBC was governed by statute. I don't think that will remove its independence, because you can change a charter, you can change a statute. In fact, the last BBC charter was changed halfway through to put more of the burden of the World Service on the BBC rather than the Foreign Commonwealth Office. So I think we'd get a more democratic debate if it was by statute, myself. But again, Google BBC Charter consultation and see if there's anything that you can reply to. But I fear in the end the Charter is not the best way of handling it.
In terms of whether you want to have statutes, I don't like the Royal Charter because it's not transparent and it's not accountable. But neither do I want politicians in charge of the media. And there lies the problem. Because you either really have to have one or the other. And statute, I suppose, is more transparent in that it then has to be debated in Parliament to change the law. But unfortunately, the quality of debate, or governments can just force their changes on Parliament. So unfortunately...
House of Lords. Oh no.
Don't get me started on the House of Lords. But in terms of neither are a particularly good mechanism for holding the media to account. They're both flawed. And Parliament is more accountable, at least we have a democratic mandate. But the danger is you do give politicians room to start interfering. So I'm not particularly keen on that, but I do accept the flaws of the Charter. I guess I don't have an answer, which is why I'm a backbencher and not the Secretary of State for DCMS.
Can I just add one thing to that then? Just going back to the Bailyn report, the Bailyn report has not been released and it wasn't covered by Freedom of Information Act. If it was governed by statute, it would be over the Freedom of Information Act.
The Bailyn report, whether the BBC is governed by a Royal Charter or statute, was not disclosable in the end according to the court, because there's an exemption. Joshua will know better. There's an exemption for journalism and so on. So whether it was statute or not, it came within that exemption. I have seen the Bailyn report, and it's nothing to get excited about. It was very similar to the Quentin Thomas debate. It said there should be more historical context, more this, more that. I don't know why people get so excited about it. It's a shame the BBC chose that particular report to stand their ground on, because it was perfectly anodyne.
I have an organisation we've been monitoring anti-Semitism online since 2008. We have a problem with the European Directive of Anti-Semitism because it doesn't include anti-Zionism. And I believe that 90% of the anti-Semitism that you're hearing on the BBC or on any other media source is anti-Zionism. And if we don't include anti-Zionist tropes, then we're not going to get anywhere. I would say predominantly most of the anti-Semitism online is anti-Israel.
There is some sort of a clause in the UMC definition which relates to what we would call anti-Zionism. The fact that the Jewish people in a unique manner are the only ones who don't deserve a state of their own is obviously a problematic issue. I don't know if it's sort of helpful or necessary or whatever to distinguish between, because the lines cross over between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism so much today that it's fairly interchangeable quite often. And yeah, it's shocking that in the 21st century we have people discussing if my country should exist or not, and I must say that every time I come to England I'm quite surprised at the level of that discussion and how socially acceptable it is, because I don't discuss if Afghanistan or France should exist in my I think it's something that is catered for in the UMC definition. It isn't perfect, but it's just about the best thing we've got at the moment, in my opinion.
So if we make a complaint to one of the BBC, regarding the BBC presenters who's reported something which we believe is anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, how do they deal with that?
At the moment they don't, because they get to decide what is anti-Semitic. But if they were to adopt either the EUMC definition or the US State Department definition, they're both quite similar in actual fact, then at least we would know where the goalposts are, and we would know if we are going to waste our time and BBC reporters' resources on a complaint or not.
Good evening. By introduction, I did contribute to the Bailyn report. I wasn't allowed to see it in spite of frequent requests because I used to advise the late Lord Hogg, who was chairman of the all-party parliamentary group on Israel. I frequently have, and I'd like the comment of the panel, or put it as a question, do you agree that when making complaints to the BBC, the problem lies right from the bottom at the Belfast call centre? The Belfast call centre, I have to put it bluntly, you can tell what part of Christianity in Northern Ireland the person taking the complaint, because they will argue with you and tell you you're wrong, or they will say, I agree with you. And the way to do it is to get them to read back what you've actually said.
Well, I wouldn't dream of phoning to make a complaint. It seems to me obvious that you write. I believe there's a form online, but I still think I would have a look at that. I wouldn't dream of phoning because you can't keep a record and you don't know what you're going to get at the other end. So the obvious answer is to write.
And write with a letter or online?
Well, I haven't tried online. My preference would be for writing a letter, I think. Because online, you never know if it's actually going to get there, do you?
I would recommend using the online form. It's a bit annoying. It limits your word space and everything, your letter count. But it's the most effective way. And it means what you should do is take a screenshot of what you've written and keep it in your archives or print it out. You can, and then you can go back, because very often things don't arrive within the designated time period that they're supposed to arrive, and so on and so forth. And you can check. You can actually check your own what you've sent and on what date and so on and so forth. That's the best way of doing it. Not telephone, letters. I don't know.
Having regard to what Baroness Deitch has said about the opacity of the Royal Charter renewal process, what inducement, if any, do you envisage you have for the process to take note of your proposals? Or, on the other hand, what sanctions do you envisage will apply if they don't take note of it? So, in other words, how, if at all, do you envisage that you will have some kind of bearing on this renewal?
A lot of people, more important than me, have made the same suggestion about having an external handler of complaints. I think John Whittingdale, who is the relevant minister, has mentioned it. As I said, Google, if you can, and get those consultation papers. Write to your MP, write to the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Keep pushing for it.
Good evening. I was one of a couple of people lucky enough to be in front of Gerald Kaufman a couple of weeks ago. I asked John Mann the next night, personally I met with John Mann, and asked him about the European definition of anti-Semitism and whether what Kaufman had said was anti-Semitic. And John Mann was very clear that anti-Semitism, and it was confirmed by the CST that evening as well with Mark Gardner, John Mann was very clear that defining anti-Semitism when it's attacks on Jews, as in if I walk around with a couple on my head and someone punches me for being a Jew, that's anti-Semitic. When it comes to any other definition with respect to Israel, it's very hard to define. And in fact, I did my research and found that the only place that the European Working Directive is accepted as a definition of anti-Semitism is, in fact, you might like this, with the NUS. In 2013, it was confirmed. So we have no formal definition of anti-Semitism with reflecting Israel. John Mann was very clear on that basis. It was very hard to prosecute or, in fact, define anyone as being anti-Semitic. I wonder what your thoughts are.
I quite agree. I mean, and there's... The BBC has used that excuse as well. They say it's been abandoned or removed or recalled, the UMC definition. It hasn't, but never mind. Yeah, but the question is, I'm Israeli, so I'm maybe a little bit different than I see things a little bit differently. But I don't believe in sitting around and waiting for somebody else to define anti-Semitism. Sorry, I'm going to define what it is, and I think that's our job, those of us who are affected by it. I think it's the job of the whole of society if they're actually interested. But when we were doing the feminist things in the 70s, we didn't sit around waiting for men to tell us what we could do and what we couldn't do. So I rather see it in the same light.
I've got in front of me what I think is the European Union working definition of anti-Semitism. I have heard that it's been withdrawn.
It hasn't, no.
Well, if it hasn't, it says, inter alia, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion. It's got lots of stuff here that I think probably many people in this audience would approve of, but I'm not sure what its status is.
The one word that bothers me, and I've contacted the BBC several times, is a one word which I think is the most poisonous word in the English language, and that word is occupation. And always the BBC refers to the occupied Palestinian territories, the occupied West Bank, and the BBC governing body approves that settlements are illegal under international law. So I have asked the BBC, and as you say, it's a tortuous journey. You've got to wait 30 days, then 60 days, and then who knows how long. I have asked them, if this is the case, whose sovereign land is being illegally occupied? Because under the 1907 Hague Regulations, in Articles 41 and 42, for occupation to take place, it must belong to a foreign sovereign. So the word occupied Palestinian territories, occupied West Bank, and if we talk about accuracy of the BBC, for a start, as soon as that word occupied is mentioned, it comes with a partner, another word, Nazi occupation. So immediately, they're the bad boys. And I've asked them, and they will not answer me, whose sovereign land is being illegally occupied. They will not answer, and we know why. So accuracy is not a matter of bias, it's a matter of not telling the truth.
The words occupation and settlements usually appear in BBC content together with I call it a mantra, and the mantra goes, according to the mantra, the settlements are illegal under international law, although Israel disagrees with this. And they write that in every single time they. My problem with it is there are some people who do think that way, but there are a lot of people in the field, professionals, who don't think that way. And it is the BBC's obligation to inform the public that there are many different opinions on this subject, and it doesn't. It informs them that there is one. And that's one of the, in my opinion, very, very serious problems, because that is denying people the ability to know that it isn't quite as cut and dried as we're pretending it is.
It should be disputed. I mean, that is the word.
Yeah, I agree.
There is a huge need for a simple pictorial PowerPoint good history of Israel and the occupied and Israel, Gaza, West Bank, and all the rest of it. And we don't have such a thing. I mean, Martin Gilbert wrote histories, but for the modern school audience and others, we really, really need that. I just wish someone would get on with it. It would be such a help for the younger generation.
I wanted to come back to Balin. First of all, Baroness Deitch, is there any precedent for the BBC spending vast sums of taxpayers' money to suppress a report that itself commissioned? And if not, surely we can bring this up again, or somebody needs to bring it up again, and at this psychological moment when the BBC is being challenged, as an example of the way they waste money. And you yourself say that you've seen it and it's quite anodyne. Well, all the more reason. You know, what were they terrified of? Surely this is something that should be brought up again in the press wherever we can, to point out that as an example of BBC bias and BBC profligacy with our money.
I'm not sure about that. It was a test case On this particular exemption, and Josh will know better than me, there are probably other cases where people have been able, are there, to hold back their documents on the grounds of this particular exemption. I think it's a shame they fixated on this particular report, but the law is now clear, and if a report is a work of journalism or an ongoing work and so on, I can't remember all the exemptions in the Act, it is safe from being revealed. I just think it's a shame they picked on that particular one, because I don't believe it would have done the BBC any harm at all. I can think of much worse examples of profligacy, actually.
I just wanted to ask, as students on university campuses, how do you suggest we combat these inaccuracies that are all across the BBC? How do we have dialogue with our fellow students at university? What do you suggest we say to them, and how do we correct what they're saying?
What we're trying to do at CAMRA is we're trying to make students write op-eds and articles on inaccuracies and events that happen on campus. We're trying to provide funding for educational events on campus and out of campus to really have another side, especially in London where the situation is getting worse and worse.
Just wanted to say firstly thank you to the panel. As a student, also a student freelance journalist, I wanted to ask, I think Cameron has done quite an admirable job so far in trying to combat not just anti-Semitism but Islamophobia and just general anti-religion problems. However, it seems to me that John Whittingdale, who is himself known to be sort of against the BBC, or at least wants a poll tax, or did before, hasn't actually been consulted properly. I wonder if there would be a way in which we could get Cameron, Whittingdale and the relevant people to actually look into specific examples, because I know Cameron has this on his agenda. He has said for the next 5 years he wants his name to be remembered for combating this. How can we actually actively get not just him but his ministers and other people to actively do something about this?
Yeah, I think it's a very good idea. Write to John Whittingdale, why shouldn't you? See if you can get him to do that. I agree with you, Cameron has made some very good moves, got the Holocaust Commission and so on, and he has said all the right things. I went to a Jewish dinner, fundraising dinner, I think it was spring, and I knew which way the election was going to go because as part of the fundraising they showed Boris saying nice things about Israel, and they showed Cameron saying nice things about Israel, and then they came up a photograph of Ed Miliband, and the whole room spontaneously booed. And I thought, oh well, you know, this is really quite significant. Maybe God had it in for him in relation to the bacon sandwich.
Is there some confidence that the BBC, this great institution which enjoys a reputation around the globe, will be capable of change? Will politicians, in the end, fearing what the reaction in the general public might be at the threat that Strictly Come Dancing or the News at 10 or Newsnight might be dramatically changed, that they will not have the nerve to make the changes that are necessary and will be stuck with the BBC much in its current form until the next charter renewal?
I mean, there's always a danger that nothing will happen. We know that danger exists, or that possibility exists. But I mean, it's not for. It's not just for the general public, because the BBC, if it doesn't pull its socks up, will just make itself irrelevant. Today there is so much information around. It's not the 1950s where you had the BBC on a little tiny black and white screen and one newspaper. We're not there anymore. A tremendous number of people don't even bother with the mainstream media anymore. There's so much more going on. So if the mainstream media wants to keep itself relevant and wants to keep itself in business, it needs to pull its socks up, because social media is behind it. All sorts of different projects that people are doing are fast on its heels, and the mainstream media needs to decide where it wants to be in 10 years' time, and that includes the BBC.
I reiterate what I said at the beginning. There is no one BBC policy on Israel. There is no diktat coming from on high. The outcome is the result of a kind of general world view that university-educated modern journalists, I think, are taking, and which they get from their newspapers, their education, their friends. It's a drip, drip, drip. And in many ways, the BBC is better, well, it's definitely better than The Guardian and the New Statesman and various other media, and very much better, of course, infinitely better than Twitter and the other areas. So we shouldn't get too fixated on the BBC. It's everywhere. And that makes the remedy even harder to find. It's everywhere that you look.
I'd just like to say first, so I've just come out of university. I did a lot of work with UJS. My time there, I was a campaigns officer, which is the sort of analogous role that I'm sure Joelle is taking on for CAMRA. And UJS have decades of experience fighting anti-Semitism on campus. They have an absolute wealth of knowledge and materials and resources, which I'm sure the students in this room can take full advantage of. And actually the 2013 motion, which included the EUMC working definition of anti-Semitism, I was part of that effort at NUS National Conference to get that motion discussed and passed. But the point I want to make now is to the panel, what do you think of room within, I'm sure you'll agree that being Zionist doesn't mean supporting every action of the current Israeli government, of Netanyahu, of all their policies. So where do you think there is room for critique on our side?
I don't know how much time you spend in Israel, but Israelis do nothing else but criticise their government. I mean, that's what we do. It's a national pastime in Israel, in various forms. You can criticise whatever you want, who you want, whenever you want, as far as I'm concerned, but just do it in the same standards, according to the same standards that you do everybody else. All I would like to see is Israel treated in exactly the same way that every other country is treated in this world. Nothing more, nothing less. That's all.
In some ways, I think the word Zionist is outmoded. I mean, Zionists got what they wanted, what we wanted, in 1948. I don't really see... It's because of the pushback. I don't really see why one has to be a Zionist in order to defend the right of Israel to exist. There are no Frenchicists or Germanists or whatever, defending the right of a particular country to exist. So in some senses, it's a shame that we still use the word Zionist. We shouldn't have to. It's only because people have had to defend the right of Israel that the word has come back into mainstream use again. So criticize all you like, but no one should criticize Israel with any more venom than they criticize, let's say, the government of Nigeria. Anyone here recently any criticism of the government of Nigeria? No? I doubt it. Than you criticize... Well, there is some criticism of Putin now, but it's never spread to boycotting Russians or demonstrations outside the Russian embassy or anything like that. So indeed one should criticize, but in a detached fashion. We're not the voters, we're not living there, we're not in the same danger that Israelis are. So I wouldn't criticize it with any more emotion or seriousness than one criticizes, let's say, even Obama or Hollande. Plenty to criticize there, or Merkel, or anybody else. It's just the same. It should be just the same.
I'm currently head of the LSE Israel Society. We recently saw on campus an exhibition which directly named and commemorated many recent standards of Israeli civilians. It's quite shocking. The university have not, in my opinion, taken it seriously enough. Neither have the student union. The student union actually responded to us saying they accepted the excuse that they were commemorating the individuals but not the actions. So what do you think can be done to create an atmosphere of pressure on universities to take these matters seriously?
I'm not sure I've got an answer to that, to be honest. It's a very serious question and a very worrying question. And a couple of years ago, I happened to be at a meeting in the Knesset, and at a subcommittee meeting in the Knesset, and the British ambassador, Mr. Matthew Gould, was at that meeting, and he was trying to persuade the Knesset that it would be wonderful if they would help him persuade Israeli students to come and study in the UK as foreign students, which of course brings in a lot of revenue to the UK. And he sat and told the Knesset subcommittee that there was no anti-Semitism on campus in Britain at all. Well, if there was, it was something, you know, in the sidelines, and you didn't need to take it seriously. And two of my children studied in this country. One studied in Huddersfield and one in Leeds, and I worked in Manchester University for a while. My son in Huddersfield, his teacher or lecturer of the history of architecture refused to mark his work because he'd been in the Israeli army. We got round that, but we need to stand up and start doing things on campus, and that's why I'm so glad that CAMERA is beginning to work here, and I hope that we will continue to do so in the future. But it's going to have to come from the public. It's going to have to come from the students, from the parents, from the public.
Going back to complaints, there was a time when I was head of an organisation called the Office of the Independent Adjudicator for Higher Education. You do have an office to which you can complain about your university once you've exhausted all the internal remedies of the university, and you should take it further. If you think that your rights have been denied or the university's broken its own rules, you must complain. Look up the university's complaints procedure. If you don't get any joy there, go on to the OIA, it's called, the Office of the Independent Adjudicator for Higher Education, and make a complaint there. I feel very sorry for today's students because they're having to fight battles that we never fought. The other thing is I'm leading in the House of Lords a debate on the 26th of November in the morning on freedom of speech, protecting freedom of speech in our universities. And if anyone here would like to send me some examples, I'd be very pleased to receive them, because there are two threats. There's a pincer movement on the universities. There's the students who are closing down free speech of their own accord, like not inviting or de-inviting Germaine Greer is a recent example. There's the unfortunate Tim Hunt, who lost his post at UCL for making a poor taste joke while he was speaking about women scientists. So you've got students who themselves are blocking freedom of speech. And then on the other side, you've got a whole lot of UK law, actually going back over 30 years, constraining what universities are supposed to allow or not allow on campus, culminating in the current Prevent guidance. So there's really quite a dramatic situation on universities, and I'd be very grateful to receive any examples, like the LSE one that you just mentioned.
I appreciate Baroness Deitch's comment that the BBC people absorb things from outside, but nevertheless, I do think that the BBC's esprit de corps is a major factor, and the BBC is a major driver of anti-Israel discourse that influences media in Britain and around the world. And therefore, I do think it is fundamentally important to deal with the BBC. And I'd like to ask this question. I appreciate all the wonderful programmes the BBC produces in so many areas, but yet, in this day and age, when it's no longer a new technology that's got off the ground, there's no need to have some kind of special public broadcaster and special privilege and tax to fund it. Do you think that we ought to be arguing that if the BBC does not get its act right, if it does not deal satisfactorily with coverage of the Middle East, it really ought to be dissolved? And it's only if that threat is staring them in their face that they might actually buck up a bit and do their job properly.
Jonathan, the admiration is reciprocal. You're flogging a dead horse. The BBC is not going to go away. It's not going to be privatised. It is the best broadcaster in the world. And while tonight we're all fixated on its Israel coverage, with no BBC supported by the licence fee, you get no proms, you get no website, you get no music education for schools, you don't get your orchestras, you don't get your choirs. There's a whole host of things that the BBC does, quite apart from news coverage. And I'm a great fan of all of them, and I think our national life would be infinitely poorer if it was all privatised and went down to the lowest common denominator. You really have to think of all the other things that the BBC does. You know, charity, fundraising, comic relief, whether you like it or not, a whole host of things that no private broadcaster would do. So I think we have to fight our corner, but there's no way that I would want to undermine the licence fee or the status of the BBC as a grand public broadcaster. And on the licence fee, my painter and decorator told me that he'd spent £515 on a ticket to see some rugby game at Twickenham a week or two ago. That's $515. A former student of mine flew in from California to see the same aforementioned rugby game, and his ticket cost £1,000. Glastonbury cost £228. You're getting a bargain. £145 for 365 days a year of education and entertainment. So I'm sorry, on this I don't agree with you.
I listened to everything that Jonathan said and you said, Baroness Deitch. Maybe the answer is to simply remove the responsibility from news, from the BBC, and keep all the good bits.
No, again, you know, we have our gripe with the BBC, but if you consider the rest of its news coverage, and the fact that you can get news all day, 24 hours a day, and the fact that what you see on Twitter and the websites is not moderated, could be made up, could be absolutely anything. I mean, it's fun, but it's not to be relied on. So I think we have to swallow this rather bitter pill and do what we can about this area. And there may be other people, I don't know, who say that the BBC's coverage of Russia is biased. I don't know, that may be the case. But all you've got to do is travel around the world, or even use your iPad to pick up news from other countries' websites and their shows, and you will see how very superior the BBC is. I mean, as I've said, I think the fault lies in their complaint system, and the fault lies in their reflecting what is now very, very common attitudes towards Israel. But as far as, you know, doing down the licence fee or stopping the BBC doing news, no, I don't go there.
Alistair Kirk, Christians United for Israel. Thank you very much to panel this evening. I just wanted to ask a question regarding social media. I appreciate that this evening the focus has been on the BBC, but many people, especially the younger generation, receive their news through social media channels only. Whilst we hold the BBC to account, and quite rightly, what would be your advice in terms of approaching those non-BBC media sources such as Sky News, ITV, Channel 4, which also have evidence of anti-Israel bias? I just wondered very briefly if your advice, bearing in mind that perhaps they are not held to account as we're not funding them as taxpayers.
I think they're regulated by Ofcom. Does anyone know whether that's the... I think they're regulated by Ofcom, so you can complain to Ofcom. The real problem lies in online, in Twitter and blogs and so on, whereas it's almost impossible to regulate, because even if you regulate it here, it comes in from all over the world. And again, the Select Committee on Communications looked at that and concluded, sadly, there's not a lot that can be done. There's now a law about trolling, I think, but it's still very hard to find out who the perpetrator is, because they may well be abroad, and you can't necessarily find out their identity. I mean, you can tweet completely anonymously, and I think it's almost impossible to find out who to. I'd rather despair. That's the price you pay for a World Wide Web.
I've just returned from 10 days abroad, so I've been subjected to the world news, BBC World News, radio and television, and where I was staying, or where I regularly stay in this particular country, they took away Sky News and put on the BBC News, and the manager of the hotel said we've had nothing but complaints because of the BBC coverage of world events generally, and particularly Israel. Now, this particular country was Iceland, where there's been a big battle, if you haven't heard about it, to stop the city of Reykjavik boycotting Israeli goods. And I helped with that, and we won. So I'm an optimist, as far as the BBC are concerned, that we can do something about it. But if you think the BBC National is bad, you want to watch and listen to the BBC World Service. And if you can't sleep at night, try listening to that, and where you mentioned the occupation. That is a regular complaint from myself and several other people, so that needs to be looked at as well. And the gentleman over there who said, I think we might do without the BBC, I'm becoming to think that way too, because we've got some marvellous independent producers and other people that seem to be working well on other channels.
Just for general information, you mentioned social media. By the way, the BBC editorial guidelines apply to their journalists' Twitter accounts. So Twitter accounts also have to be accurate and impartial, like BBC content. So that's one thing to know. You can make a complaint about a tweet sent by a BBC reporter. And the point about the World Service, I think that's a very relevant point. And I think another relevant point is there's a lot of BBC content published in foreign languages. I've noticed some very problematic things in Arabic lately. Unfortunately, I don't have the time or the resources to monitor it full time at the moment, but I'm hoping to change that. But again, that's something that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Well, it's plain that I'm a fan of the BBC existence, save insofar as I think it needs an external complaint system. And there are many, many criticisms of its coverage. And I've got a whole lot more here, but I thought I'd focus on the complaints procedure this evening. I agree with you about the Arabic service. I mean, I don't speak Arabic, of course, but I have heard from people who do that a lot of things are being said by the BBC Arabic service that would be shocking if they were said in English here. And if someone can cover that would be good. All I can say is keep complaining. If you're a student, complain to the OIA. If you're going to complain to the BBC, make sure you get those editorial guidelines. And make your complaint unemotional and as legalistic as you can make it, and keep going. And my heart goes out to those students who are in the front line, because many students, understandably, just want to have a good time at university. And it's a pity that some of them feel they have that burden on their shoulders. So good luck to you at the LSE and so on.
I'm not going to comment on the presentations because I was largely not here for them. Unfortunately, we had a series of votes, which is why I was away. But I just wanted to give you one tip in terms of shaping policy towards the BBC. There's clearly some momentum about reforming the complaints process. And I just wanted to comment on two things. In terms of Sky News and the other broadcasters, I don't get complaints. I think in the last 5.5 years, I can remember 1 or 2 complaints about Sky, lots more about the BBC. So we don't seem to have the problem with Sky and ITN. But I'm not a great fan of the BBC, but I do think it's there for reform rather than abolition. But I would also say if you do, I had this conversation with the Foreign Office Minister about the Foreign Office bias against Israel. And the difficulty, and this was a minister who was predisposed in favour of Israel, but the post bag was 10-1. When something blew up, it was 10-1 against Israel, and that shapes a minister's response. And so for a long time I'd been arguing, if you are complaining, then you have to put pen to paper. But if you are writing to the BBC, then copy in, John Whittingdale will not love me for saying this, but copy in the Secretary of State at DCMS. Because once the government departments start to have their desk weighed down with complaints, that shapes public policy. The BBC might be independent. I tried to, in fact, when Sharon first raised this issue with me, probably about 18 months, 2 years ago, I tried to get a debate on the BBC bias. And I was firmly told, you can't have one because it doesn't report to Parliament. And therefore I couldn't call the debate. So there's a way of bringing the BBC to heel. But the biggest way is to shape public policy by copying in the relevant ministers. Once they have a weight of letters on their desk, they will start to say what's going on. But my job tonight was really meant to host, but unfortunately Sharon's had to step in. But I have listened to a lot of what Baroness Deitch and Haidar said, and I agree entirely. And I think there's a lot of work to be done. But I'm also impressed that many of these events in Parliament are also always well attended. Often we are kind of talking to ourselves. So to actually get such a large audience is a testament to how much this topic resonates with the community. So also thank you to you, Sharon, for the work you do, but also nagging me to get this event sorted.
The other thing I want to say about the BBC is that the BBC was invited to participate in this debate at quite a high level, and they declined. And they declined on the basis that they're not answerable to Parliament. So we have to think about that. Should they have been here? Should they not have been here? I don't know. That's up to you. You can write to them if you wish. I'd like to thank Haidar for the amazing work she does. I am in awe of Haidar. Haidar puts out at least one bulletin every single day, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. She lives up there, up north, on the Golan Heights, near the border. She hears sometimes the bombs and the explosions and so on, and she carries on. Sometimes she doesn't have internet connection because of where she lives, but there she is. She's an amazing woman, and we thank her so much for all the work that she does. And thank you to Baroness Deitch, who is an amazing voice for our cause. And after all, that is our cause. I'm sure there are other groups who have their cause, but this is our cause. And thank you so much for participating and helping us in this way. And thank you all for coming.